Right, the morning after the Friday night session.
I have been fascinated by English traditional music for years and years.
I think I might be able to get Joe on board to play some bagpipes.
Because the source material is always weird, it's always strange. But that's kind of the fun of it. And I have been absolutely blown away by how much easier generative AI has made it. Hi, welcome if you're new, welcome back if not. In this video series, I do three things. 1, arrange and record music in my home studio in this narrowboat on the Thames. 2, plan and shoot music videos for that music. And 3, document how it went, what worked and what didn't. So strap yourselves in for the highest low stakes on the internet. I'm James Bell, and this is The Process. I'm really sorry. I've lured you here under false pretenses with the implication that I might be doing cover versions of songs that you like or even have heard of. Actually, it was just a bait and switch to give me the opportunity to nerd the fuck out about 19th century broadside ballads like this. Let me explain. Okay, so finally I get to play with traditional tunes. There will be a video somewhere around here which will explain my complicated relationship with folk music. See, the problem with filming in a museum is that even when it's empty, me standing here means that people walking by think, oh, something interesting's going on, and then they come in. So I kind of feel like I'm going to be hauled up on espionage charges. Anywho, trying to vlog in a museum in the middle of the summer holidays is like one of those dreams where you just really need a piss, and everywhere you go, someone appears out of nowhere. It appears to be quiet in the bling rooms. People don't seem to like bling. Let's do the bling rooms. Welcome to my bling. Oh yeah. Seat. Okay, so I was gonna do this bit in the museum, but this just isn't working. I'm like hiding in the corner, whispering into my phone. So, all right, nice idea in principle, but back to me in the studio. Okay, fair enough. Right. I have been fascinated by English traditional music for years and years. But I've got a very ambivalent relationship with the English folk music scene. You might notice I use the word traditional music. I generally don't use folk music to describe what I do. And it comes down to this ambivalence. Now, the leading lights of the English folk music scene make some of my favorite music. They're mind-bogglingly talented. I know a few of them enough to sort of say hello to. But the scene more generally, I've always felt it's kind of cliquey. My friends have sort of felt it's kind of cliquey. And probably even the big names in the scene feel it's kind of cliquey. That's part of the reason. But maybe a bigger reason is that from when I first got into it quite late, I already had a bit of a sense of English history. And I do feel like English folk music has always got this weird kind of absence of historical context, like the British Empire and its legacy never really existed. You know, it's sort of tangential, you know, sometimes these folk songs will brush up against it, but that's clearly not what the folk music audience in this country wants. And like post-Brexit and post-Empire and post-everything, I personally feel that's kind of a problem. So I never really referred to myself as a folk musician until a few years ago, when I was just like, you know what, this is just such a mouthful to explain all this stuff. Yeah, like, it's fine. Like, if I've got to explain what I'm doing, folk music is the closest. So yeah, I'm a folk musician. I've run a folk music session for over 15 years. We try and kind of make it as uncliquey and as welcoming as possible. So yeah, I'm a folk fine. Just a couple of months ago, it was Twitter drama. Of course it's Twitter drama. Made me, and the way in which folk music was kind of policed on Twitter made me feel like, nah, you know what? I'm not going to use folk. It made me think, you know what? I'm a folk music fan. I'm going to keep going to festivals. I'm going to keep going to sessions. I'm going to keep doing the Bastard English Folk Session, which I do. But I'm not going to say I'm an English folk musician. All of this is a long way of saying, okay, so why have I picked the track that I'm picking? I thought, all right, I'm going to sort of start as I mean to continue by not picking something which I heard of from musicians who got it from musicians who got it from musicians who got it from folk collectors like Cecil Sharp. That's fine. It's just not particularly what I'm interested in. I want to go back to the original source and do my own take on whatever it is I want to do. So, the song that I've picked is called Young Man Cut Down in His Prime. It's known by tons of different names. Probably The Unfortunate Rake is the most common name. I think that's the name that a lot of the big names in English folk music have done versions of it as. I'm not going to be paying attention to them. Again, that's cool. That's not really what I'm interested in. I want to do my own research and, yeah, find my own take. But why this song particularly? I just find it's a really interesting broadside ballad. There's so much going on in this song. This song has apparently influenced so many other folk songs. Some you may have heard of if you've heard of the song House of the Rising Sun. That's apparently kind of at least influenced by this song. There's just a lot in there. Like, to a certain extent, I haven't had the time and the bandwidth to really get stuck into adapting trad stuff for years. I cannot wait. But like, I'm not going to nerd out now. Like, trust me, there's a lot going on in this song. I'll kind of come back to it. The whole history of music is really too big a chocolate pudding to tackle in one go, so let's narrow it down. Our little history starts in England in the early 1500s. Music is generally not written down and stored because that's expensive. The church has been doing it for centuries, and from time to time, a wealthy patron might pay a composer for some bespoke music. Other than that, there wasn't much of it going on. Then two things happened that changed everything. The movable type printing press started to become affordable, and this bloke broke with the Church of Rome and declared himself head of the new Church of England. Now, the Vatican wasn't super happy with this, at first condemning him to hell through excommunication, and in later years pushing nearby countries like Spain to invade and reclaim England for Catholicism. Much of England was still devoutly Catholic, and this led the English crown to do something pretty desperate. Print the Bible in English and teach everyone to read it. On the surface, this seemed like a good idea, because then everyone could see that much of what they'd been taught by Roman Catholicism wasn't actually backed up by the Bible. But it had one pretty big side effect for the English crown. Suddenly, you're ruling a population that can read. Sure, they can now educate themselves enough to see through the shenanigans of the Catholic Church of the day, but sooner or later, they'll start seeing through your shenanigans too, which is arguably what happened a century later in the English Civil War, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. One of the less violent outcomes of this English information revolution was the birth of a commercial, popular music business based on a product that would last right up to the late 1800s, the broadside ballad. Broadsides were the names given to single sheets of paper that were sold in many places but mainly on the streets. They might contain political rants, parodies, pornography, the same basic stuff that makes up much of the internet today. But of the broadsides that have survived, most are songs. A broadside seller would often stand in the street and sing, much like a modern busker, and their partner would go through the crowd and sell that song to passers-by. And probably pick your pocket if you're not paying attention. These broadside ballads would tend to have a woodcut image at the top, and the songs would be long with many verses, because the typeface size was small and fixed, and 3 verses followed by half a blank page just looks weird. And they would be just words, not music, because printing music notation as well would require a whole other printing block system. Under the ballad title, however, might be something like "To the Tune of the Three Ravens." These ballads started out as something of a luxury product, but quite quickly became mass entertainment and ended up becoming the musical equivalent of penny dreadfuls. And they were very popular in England, thanks to the high literacy, but they were popular wherever there were movable type printing presses, and it can often be difficult to be certain which country they truly originated in. For example, the song might have been written in Sweden and then travelled to Ireland with merchants who translated it, and then be first published in London. Unless we had detailed records of all of that, we'd tend to assume it originated in England. Eventually, printing got more sophisticated. Sheet music with both words and music overtook broadsides, and later still, recorded music eclipsed both of them. But from the early 1500s to the late 1800s, broadsides were the beating heart of English popular music. What I want to do is pick songs that say something about the world we live in at the moment, and I want to do a version of them with instruments which, if not historically accurate, are kind of historically accurate adjacent. But I also want to bring in elements of modern popular music as well. I want to try and make these songs accessible, because when I was trying to find out the culture that I came from, England and English culture and English music, I found it weird and alienating and impenetrable. And that's kind of understandable because, as that old saying, the past is another country. Like a lot of how things happen in the past are just kind of strange. What I want to try and do is translate that. And that's kind of where the challenges are, because when you look at the sources, there are so many kind of lyric and music choices in these old songs that are just fucking strange to modern ears. And I want to editorialize and explain what I think they mean without tampering with it too much and making it, I mean, to a certain extent, I'm not doing historical reenactment, so it is going to have my opinion and my take on it, and that's kind of part of the point of it. But yeah, that's the challenge for me. It's always the challenge. It's why adapting traditional music is so much more difficult than just writing an original song. You know, I feel like I could write something that just makes much more sense and feels much more like a real old song if I just did it myself and didn't worry about the source material, because the source material is always weird. It's always strange. But that's kind of the fun of it. I find the weirdness and the eccentricity is what makes it fascinating. Particularly as often it's telling you things about the past that are unexpected, that suggest that it's much more similar to the present than you might have thought. That's really the fun part for me. It's finding what is different and what is similar through popular culture, not through historical records on the great men, but from these kind of curious angles, from the things that people at the time considered to be trivial. That's, if you want to find out what really happened, look at the trivia. The trivia will always tell you more than the records people made that they thought were important. So that's some things. How do I think it's going to make me feel is always a question I kind of come back to. It's, this is music, so this for me is always about emotion. I don't quite know. In fact, I've got no idea what the emotion of this song is going to be, because I don't know what vocal melody I'm going to go with. I don't even know whether or not there is a sort of established melody that, most folk musicians use. If there is, I might use it. I might not. The subject matter is pretty dark. So I would, probably look for a vocal melody and therefore an accompaniment that matches that mood. That said, the song is very similar to the kind of, American cowboy song Streets of Laredo. And that's in a major key. That's kind of, it's wistful, but it's kind of jaunty. So I don't know. I like that may be a direction I go in. We shall see. Let's get down to it. By the way, for complicated reasons, I can't actually include the music video in this episode, but there will be a link to it at the end. If you want a sneak peek now, or if you'd like to learn even more about how it was made, there's links in the description. Anyway, on with the show. So time to brainstorm ideas about how to adapt this song. But I realize actually I need to backtrack a little bit. So I talked quite a lot about why I picked this particular song, but I really just said why it was that I was interested in broadside ballads rather than anything else. I didn't really go into why this song particularly. And I feel like I need to give a little bit of context. So I suppose a good example is the English Folk Dance and Song Society holds this very nerdy event, Broadside Day, where all of the people who are nerds for broadside ballads get together and listen to the researchers talking about their latest research. I was at this event a number of years ago and I had this epiphany. As the researchers were kind of talking through broadside ballad after broadside ballad, I really got the sense of, what if I've got these ballads wrong? What if they're just really bad? What if they're just really badly written? I mean, I had it in my head that I'd sort of uncovered this treasure trove of pulp literature, historical pulp literature. But here's the thing about pulp literature. Like, everyone always assumes it's going to be Quentin Tarantino or Raymond Chandler, and you may like them or may not, but it's a fair statement to make that they're very good at crafting that particular pulp aesthetic. Like, they're not half-assed. Pulp is half-assed, sort of by definition. And so many of these songs are just, when I hear people kind of whining about the music that's in the charts, I'm like, pal, when I'm looking for broadsides to adapt, if I found something that was half as well written as the worst written song in the charts, I'd be over the moon. This stuff is so badly put together. I was once at a folk session after someone sang a particularly long and boring song, and a friend of mine turned to me and I just think encapsulated, he was like, what just happened? That was just a series of events. And I think that's a great way of describing it. Like, a lot of broadside ballads to me, just like, I don't understand what the point, this is just a series of events. Like, a farmer goes to market to get some chickens and they don't have any chickens, so he gets ducks. The end. You're like, what just happened? So it made me realize that if I'm going to adapt broadside ballads, one of the necessary evils is I just need to go through a lot of them, because a lot of them just don't interest me. And the reason why I picked Young Man Cut Down on His Prime is really just because I looked at it and I thought, I like this. This is a good story. It's really interesting. It stuck with me for a while afterwards and left me with lots of intriguing questions. Why was this written? What was the person thinking? Is a lot of broadside ballads, people just wrote down their true experiences? A lot of them are just fiction. And I just felt like I don't feel like I understand what's going on in this song, but I'd like to. So I had it kind of earmarked as maybe that'll be pretty high on the list when I finally get around to adapting them. So, okay, this is a broadside ballad that I find interesting. Now what? How do we go about adapting it? Well, if you're an academic researching a broadside like this, you have to be extremely neutral and say, well, here's what the evidence supports. If you're in the arts, you get to wildly speculate, and that's the thing that I find fun. So, if I'm going to think about what arrangement to do, what instruments to pick, what tonality to use, because the tune doesn't come with a broadside, that's a whole other thing. So there's a lot of questions to ask, and before I can really get down to that, I feel like I need to understand the tone of the song, like the emotion, and in order to get that, I need to get the subject matter, like what is this song about? And for me, that means trying to get a sense of who might have written this and What message might they have wanted to communicate, and how do I feel about that message? As I say, wild speculation, the fun stuff. Now, I discovered this song years ago and made a note of it, and in that time I've had it in my head that this was a kind of woman-shaming song. I remembered the focal point as sort of being this chorus where the person dying of venereal disease says, you know, if she'd just told me that she had venereal disease, you know, there's a sort of a women, am I right vibe to it. Or at least that's what I thought. As I've come back to read it now, I'm now left with a different sense. I don't feel like that's what the person who wrote the song was trying to communicate. The sense that I really get is they are trying to communicate just how horrific venereal disease is. There's a reference made to salts of mercury, so I'm assuming it's syphilis, which mercury was the sort of main treatment for that. Syphilis is a nasty disease. And that made me think about a passage I read recently in the book The World of Yesterday, written in the 1940s by Stefan Zweig. I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation, apologies. He was writing about what living in Austria was like before, I suppose, before the works of Sigmund Freud really had their major impact. He was writing about how sex was talked about. It wasn't talked about, but it wasn't talked about in a kind of pathological way. He writes about the extremes to which the sort of, you know, Viennese bourgeoisie just didn't want to acknowledge that sex even existed. He said about how if, you know, a woman referred to a man's trousers, that was seen as pornographic. He talks about how, you know, in some extreme circumstances, you know, women, well, he talks about how women were, all of the sort of institutions and social pressure were to make sure that women knew nothing about sex and kind of nothing about the world generally. So they would end up being completely dependent on the male figures in their lives, husbands, father figures, etc. He talked about how in extreme circumstances women were encouraged to bathe clothed so that they might, he said it's plausible that, you know, they might go through their entire adult lives never having seen their own bodies, which is just fucked up. But he talks about one particular, you know, particularly negative outcome of this, which was the huge market for sex workers that was treated as taboo and therefore was extremely unsafe in terms of venereal disease for both the sex workers and their customers. And that's the real sense I get from this song, is there is this chorus of had she but told me, or whatever the words are. And it just feels like this is what happens when a culture doesn't talk about this stuff. That's my sense of it from having read it now. Okay, cool. Let's go a bit deeper. Let's try and bring in a historical context. Who would have written this and why? So as I came back to this the other day, what it made me think of is maybe this is what Peter Smith calls an urban hazard ballad. He's a broadside researcher who noticed that a lot of these ballads between 1800 and 1900 that were about kind of innocents from the country going to the city, getting ripped off, or worse, getting sexually assaulted or getting murdered. And his explanation for this was that in 1800, the population of the country, like I think 80% of the country lived in rural areas. 100 years later, in 1900, 75% of the country lived in urban areas. That is a massive shift from country to city. And it was a massive culture shock, particularly for working class, you know, farm labourers moving into often these very grim factory conditions. I think this is also why there's a lot of music hall songs in this period that are just really going hard on the sort of rural nostalgia, because for a lot of the people, a lot of the music hall audience, they'd either come from farming lifestyles or they were kind of one or two generations removed. And everything that was good about it was kind of good box office for musical. So I was thinking maybe this song fit into that, but then looking closely at it, no, it's not. It doesn't fit with that kind of model of someone, the gist of the song being "Come warning, take by me," warning people from the country of the dangers of the city. This is different. This is the ballad writer is going out walking one morning, as they always do, and stumbling across the subject matter of their song. In this case, a comrade, presumably Army or Navy comrade. I'm guessing probably Navy from the time period, or maybe Army. A comrade who is wrapped in white linen, suggesting that they're kind of already dead, wasting away from this horrible disease, who basically says, remember me, can you do these things for my funeral? And the impression I really get reading it is the writer is really emphasizing how kind of disgusting the illness is. There's reference made to the dying man says, can you get people to bring roses to hide the smell of the corpse as it passes? And later it's going to reference to lavender. For me, that's what it feels like the main thing that's getting pushed is. So who wants young men to avoid getting venereal disease? I mean, you would hope everyone would, but for a balladeer or a music hall performer, this is a kind of an odd subject to pick. If someone's just invented this scenarios, it's a good story. It's kind of dark. It's not really those kind of music hall Friday night, everyone sing along with the chorus vibes. It might have been someone who was writing from their own experience, but again, it's dark subject matter. And this makes me feel like one of the things that broadside nerds often talk about is you do often get the sense that there's kind of PR and marketing going on, that wealthy people would approach these songwriters and say, have a few shillings, write me a song about. And yeah, that's so I started to think, is there anyone that would benefit from songs preventing or kind of trying to lead young men away from venereal disease? Maybe the church, and maybe the church. But generally speaking, if it's a church message, the church is generally pretty explicit about it, and then it wants you to sign up for Jesus if you're not really signed up at the end of it. So possible, but it would be odd that there's no other religious mention in there. Eventually I came to the conclusion, I think I know, who would want this message. I feel like this is military propaganda, because sexually transmitted diseases have always in military history been a major, major problem. You can look at it in a very, sort of brutal, calculus way that any soldier or sailor is going to be very expensive in terms of recruitment and resources, and for them to get killed, or more expensively still, for them to be kind of infirmed long term. That's really expensive. And they're taken out of action when you actually need them in battle. But to be a bit more charitable and a bit less cynical, a lot of military personnel will have to care for people who are dying from these horrible diseases, and that's a really unpleasant thing. You don't want to have these kind of young men brought into the army or the navy and then just watch them waste away horribly and there's nothing you can do about it. So yeah, that's kind of my sense, that maybe this is, it's kind of the only tool in the toolbox for the army, because soldiers and sailors are going to go on leave, and it's very difficult to enforce what they do when they're on leave, kind of by definition. That's sort of the point of leave. So I wonder if songs like these were pretty much all they could do. Sorry to have really gone into the weeds on this, but this for me is not just the fun part, or one of the fun parts, but also I need to figure this stuff out before I actually start the adapting process. So I feel like this has told me who I think wrote this. And the question then becomes, okay, cool, what's my take on it? And I do feel like, okay, yeah, this is a morality tale, I feel like. But I don't feel like the sin is sex or casual sex or even sex with a sex worker, which is maybe kind of implied in this song. I feel it's The sin is the culture that doesn't talk about sex and that makes it taboo. And I don't want to suggest that this young man is dying because of society's repression. He's dying because of a disease. Like, it's also worth acknowledging, like, these diseases exist and they're horrible. There are treatments now, but like, they're horrible. But these problems, I feel like, are much less severe when you actually bring them out in the open and talk about them. So that's going to be the gist of it. So yeah, this is going to be a song which is going to be about sex. And lots of people write about sex, and that's a good thing. But one of the things I do feel is that there's a lot of art that's about a very narrow view of sex, usually kind of made by dudes like me. And one thing, for example, that people don't tend to write about, they write about sexual attraction a lot, but they don't write about the kind of the flip side of that, which is sexual repulsion. So yeah, I feel like the kind of tone I'm going to be looking for is actually something I often lean towards, which is sort of dark, twisted body horror. I'm not interested in making every kind of traditional adaptation just gruesome, but I do think that's what's interesting about this one.
As I went out walking on the streets of Laredo, as I went out walking in Laredo one day, I spied a young cowboy wrapped up in white linen, wrapped up in white linen and cold as the clay.
Okay, I actually just want to come back to an earlier point I made, because now that I've got an excuse to do a bit more researching about broadside ballads, I think I was being unfair when I was saying about how the general quality of broadside ballads wasn't very good. I think I wasn't really aware of how, particularly later on, writing, printing and selling broadsides was one of the few ways that people who were desperately poor could avoid getting arrested for begging. Like, there was a whole culture of tinkers, people who would sell, things they would make, like pin cushions or sort of needles and this kind of thing. And it was the only employment they could get. And really the cheapest thing they could sell was ballads. Often this was what was stopping people from starving. This is what was stopping people from going to debtor's prison, stopping people from just getting pulled down that spiral of poverty. So it feels a bit glib for me to be just like, oh yeah, they couldn't write songs. Writing meticulously crafted songs might not have been their top priority. And I think it's fair to add that as some balance. And actually, I feel like if you bear that in mind, I can come back to these broadside ballads with a bit more of an insight into, songs that may seem like they're just kind of innocuous and irrelevant and just a series of events. Maybe there's actually a sense of desperation there, that this is what is going to pay for this person's only meal of the day or something like that. That it gives it kind of a bit more of an intensity to it. And yeah, maybe I shouldn't just be kind of cynical about it. Okay, so I feel like I've got a sense of what the tone of the track is. Time to start thinking about the vocal melody. I did a little bit of digging around to try and, hear some other versions. And I discovered that there was an album, a compilation from 1960 called The Unfortunate Rake, which is just like 20 different versions of this song, and the various kind of spin-offs of them. One of which is St. James Infirmary, or St. James's Hospital, which is another quite well-known spin-off.
Well, I went down to the St. James Infirmary to see my baby there. She was lying on a long white table, so sweet, so cold, so fair.
There's a lot of big names in folk singing here. A.L. Lloyd, Ewan MacColl, Peggy Seeger, Pete Seeger, Alan Lomax. And yeah, there's a lot to go on in there. Listening to it, one of the things that leaps out to me is that there doesn't seem to be one melody, which is not really surprising, as the kind of Cowboy's Lament, Streets of Laredo version tends to be in a major key. In fact, some of the Young Man Cut Down on His Prime variations are in a major key as well. But generally, the sort of the kind of the STD one, which tends to be in a minor key, and the Cowboy one, which tends to be in a major key, and like a few other ones in between. There's some versions, incidentally, where the genders switch. There's the Bad Girls Lament. So there's a lot to listen to in this one. I don't know how much I want to get distracted, as I said, by for a song like this, there's going to be loads and loads of interesting variations, but I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. I'm down like 6 rabbit holes as it is. But one thing that does seem clear to me is that a lot of these songs have got a similar melodic shape, whether or not it's major or minor. Streets of Laredo, St. James's Hospital. And I think I will probably come up with a new melody that's kind of an amalgamation of the different versions that keeps that melodic shape. Sort of goes up and goes down at the points where both the major and the minor versions change. But I might put my own stamp on it as well. We'll see. I'll also try to stop slapping this and then moving the camera. All right, a couple of quick points. I'm working on the melody. I'm spending a lot of time trying to pick the right notes, which may sound a bit excessive, but I want to get the basics right. I want to get the emotion, the tone right, etc. I was listening through another version of this album I mentioned, The Unfortunate Rake. And it reminded me of a very well-known traditional song. We'll rance and we'll roar like true British sailors. We'll rance and we'll roar along the salt sea until we strike soundings in the channel of old England. From Ushant to Scilly, it's 35 leagues. Or if you're a fan of the film Jaws, and why wouldn't you be, a version of this song crops up. In fact, actually, it's in John Williams' score towards the end of it. The shark hunter Quint sings a major version of the same song. Farewell and adieu to you fair Spanish maidens. Farewell and adieu to you ladies of Spain. It's interesting how the rhythm of those songs is very similar to the rhythm of this and the kind of variegations like Streets of Laredo. So that's one interesting point. The other more significant point is I rambled on and on about my theory of how maybe this was written as a means of kind of Army or Navy propaganda, as a way of discouraging personnel from going to sex workers. I don't think that holds up. I've read the lyrics a bit more closely. He makes reference to how he got this from his heart's delight. Maybe his heart's delight is a sex worker, maybe. But I think that feels like reaching to me. I feel like if that was the case, that point would have been made more clearly. Instead, I think the implication is that this man got venereal disease, presumably syphilis, from a girlfriend. And maybe that's why I was initially thinking it was a bit more woman shaming, that was the kind of, that maybe that means that the emphasis now is more on the tragedy is that she didn't tell him. I don't know. I'm kind of at a bit of a loss now as to what the song is about. So I'll keep kind of mulling on that. Maybe it was still propaganda and they just didn't want to mention sex workers because they felt that was inappropriate. But again, that kind of feels like reaching. I mean, it's pretty graphically describing dying from venereal disease. So yeah, who knows? Anyway, more on this as it unfolds. Oh yeah, one more quick point. Whether this is relevant, I don't know. I keep talking about The Unfortunate Rake. The original broadside, I think, is The Unfortunate Lad. And there's an Irish tune called The Unfortunate Rake. And it may be the case that this was sung to the Irish tune. I don't know which came first, if the two are related. But I realised that, yeah, they're two kind of separate things. And if I'm talking about the broadside ballad, the title that's mainly used is The Unfortunate Lad. This is kind of standard nerd level for me. So let's think about the arrangement. What instruments are we going to use? Well, something that I would really like to do is to ask my friends on the local folk scene to collaborate on these tracks, seeing as collaboration is such an important part of this genre. It's kind of easier said than done, though. I mean, what I would ideally like is for them to be in the videos, but that's kind of an ask. I think if someone was to ask me that, I'd be pretty self-conscious about it. There's also the slightly weird thing of payment. Musicians should be paid, and when I've collaborated with friends in the past, I've often paid people, even if it's a bit weird. But on the other hand, if I'm doing something on someone else's project, usually, if it's just kind of like a local music thing, I don't want to take money. I'm actually far more interested in whether or not I think the result's going to be good enough to be worth my time, to be totally honest. Anyway, this weekend is a good opportunity to find this out, because Oxford has a thriving folk session scene. Folk sessions are basically folk music jam sessions, and they'll be like the third Monday of every month. And every once in a while, there just happens to be a sort of long weekend where there's so many sessions that it almost forms a mini festival. We've taken to calling it the half marathon. So tonight is the Friday night session that I run. Tomorrow afternoon is the LGBTQ session. The day after, Sunday lunchtime, is the bookshop/coffee shop session. Sunday evening is Trad Irish. Monday evening is the sing around. Anyway, I'll see who I can talk to and see if something comes out of it.
Right, the morning after the Friday night session. I think I might be able to get Joe on board to play some bagpipes. We'll see how it goes. Just one of the great things I like to show off after a session is I just do so much kind of screaming and singing all the way through it. My voice drops a knock. Check this out. Rolling home when we go rolling home when we go rolling, rolling when we go rolling home. I can't do that normally.
Stacey's mom has got it going on. Stacey's mom has got it going on. Stacey's mom has got it going on. I'm in love with Stacey's mom.
Do you ever get like a light bulb moment with an artist when you just suddenly realize, why am I not a fan of this person? Like, everything they do is the kind of thing I like. This morning at breakfast, my wife said to me, can I just play you this amazing Johnny Cash track I heard while watching the Athletics? And she played The Man Comes Around. And she said, do you know it? And I was like, it's familiar. I know the album, or at least I know of the album that it's from, because I know a lot of other songs on there and they're all bangers. I don't know why I haven't got into it. Johnny Cash, right at the end of his life, did a number of albums with producer Rick Rubin, entitled like American 1, American 2, American 3. This is American 4. And I thought, yeah, this sound would be good for the Young Man Cut Down on His Prime track. Incidentally, whenever I make notes of Young Man Cut Down on His Prime, I just put Young Man, which means every time I see that, I just get YMCA by the Village People stuck in my head. Anyway, I thought this would be good for Young Man Cut Down on His Prime. And then I realized, oh yeah, probably the reason why I think that is that one of the tracks on this album is Streets of Laredo. And actually, the first time I heard that song, Streets of Laredo, was that Johnny Cash version. And I probably discovered it the last time I was researching Young Man Cut Down on His Prime. I really like the immediacy of the sound. Like, this album is incredibly minimal in the best sense. And incredible though this may be to learn for you, I'm not great at minimalism historically. I'm a little bit maximalist, and I'm, trying to learn how to dial it down a bit. This album really nails it. Everything is so far forward in the speaker. Everything's like right in your ears. It sounds like he's just sitting next to you playing this. Unlike, say, like a Motown track where it sounds like they're kind of the other end of a huge hall, which is a great sound for some situations. But for this emotion, I really like that immediacy. So yeah, I might at least use that as a starting point. There is, however, a downside to using Johnny Cash's Streets of Laredo as a template for Young Man Cut Down on His Prime. If I'm trying to do a distinctive version of Young Man Cut Down on His Prime, there's already a song that sounds very similar that already has that Johnny Cash sound. It's by Johnny Cash. It's called The Streets of Laredo. So yeah, that's a bit of a danger. That said, I do think 70% of that Johnny Cash sound is being Johnny Cash. So at least that's not something I need to worry about. Okay, so I'm starting to get a little bit deeper into the arrangement. Already established that I'd like to get some friends into play and lean into the collaboration side of folk music if it's all possible. But I need to think about the sort of basic building blocks, like what instruments am I going to use? So the instrument I kind of assumed that I would use as the main one is this. This is a bouzouki. A bouzouki is traditionally a Greek instrument, but it's become part of Irish folk music because it just blends very well, more so than a guitar, with fiddles, squeeze boxes. It's got double coursed strings, so much like a 12 string, it's two little strings next to each other, and there's four of them rather than the six strings of a standard tuned guitar. It's a little bit higher, it's a little bit punchier. Now, I think one of the reasons why the bouzouki has become the sort of preferred strumming accompaniment in folk music is that, apart from the fact that it maybe is a little bit brighter and thinner and punchier sonically than, an acoustic guitar, I think there's also the fact that this is closer to the instruments that preceded the guitar. One instrument it's particularly similar to is the citern. More this sort of shape, actually maybe closer to a mandolin, sonically even not a million miles away from a ukulele. Higher, they were very portable, they always used to have them apparently in barbershops. It used to be a barbershop thing that there would be a citern lying around that you could pick up and play, and they would have elaborate headstocks. And I had a sense of that history, and maybe I'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into that at some point. But I thought, okay, if we're looking at a traditional broadside ballad, maybe that's the kind of sound we want. But I am aware of the fact that this broadside ballad is approximately dated at the 1860s, and whilst it might be older, 1860s is right sort of at the end of the history of broadsides, when there was sheet music that was much more available, music hall was much more of a thing, and broadsides were kind of pretty cheap, and I think I mentioned earlier, similar to Penny Dreadful. So they were more likely to be sung unaccompanied. And also, I'm not sure how much any kind of guitar-based instrument, similar to kind of guitar, lute, citern, whatever, was being played in the 1800s, in England at least. It probably was, but I'm sort of not really aware of it. What you're more likely to get is this is really the rise of the squeeze boxes. And I've wondered, should this be something I sing with the squeeze boxes being the main accompaniment? This is a melodeon, diatonic DG. It's got a very particular sound that anyone who's been near Morris dancing will recognise. But I do still wonder whether or not that's going to be the right emotion that I'm looking for. And here's where we kind of get to the big decision that I need to make. Because I was initially thinking, yeah, I should go with the bouzouki sounding like a citern because that's more traditional, even if it's not necessarily traditional in that period. But I found that approach to be a double-edged sword in the past. I think it can be a real trap to get too bogged down in the tradition instead of deciding, all right, this is not historical reenactment. This is not something I would perform with similar nerdy musicians dressed in medieval garb or whatever doing it. This is supposed to be a modern interpretation. So maybe I shouldn't get too bogged down in that. And again, that's why maybe the Hona Polka work is just not quite the right sound. And then I thought, I mean, I brought this guitar, which is my main guitar, which has been with me since the mid-90s. Really just so I could kind of play it for context to compare it against the bouzouki. But now I'm wondering whether or not this is actually, it's such a kind of gentle sound. That maybe that's got the kind of melancholy that I'm looking for. And then I remembered, I have done recordings where I've actually used both nylon string guitar and bouzouki, one pan left, one pan right, and the two seem to blend together pretty well. So that might be something that I go for. I think one of the things that I'm really thinking about is having decided to just explore that Johnny Cash album to get some inspiration. I read about how when Johnny Cash started, Sam Phillips, the legendary producer at Sun Studios, listened to his voice and was like, you're the kind of musician that should have like you and a guitar and maybe another instrument and another instrument of that, like tops, certainly no more than 4 instruments. So it would be him, it would be a guitar, then maybe a piano or another guitar, and then maybe double bass or drums, but a small group of musicians. And already I'm starting to think, maybe I could do nylon string, bouzouki, squeeze box, get a friend to do some bagpipes, and then I'm already starting to maximize it. So these are some choices I need to make. I kind of felt like I was going to record this having decided it was going to be the bouzouki. But it was really just getting this set up and then just playing this nylon string that made me think I'm kind of leaning more towards this. Again, maybe both, but yeah, I'm confused.
All right, last night I had a bit of an epiphany, not just about this song, Young Man Cut Down in His Prime, but about how I've been approaching traditional music generally and what I've actually wanted from it, like why I've been doing it. This, on the subject of why I'm doing it, this video series starts with me saying, why have I picked this track? And I did this with this song. And then I had to come back to it and say, okay, no, I talked about why I wanted to do broadside ballads. I didn't talk about why I wanted to do this song particularly. And then I talked a bit more. I think I still didn't quite capture why this particular song. Yesterday I was thinking about, okay, so how am I going to arrange it? How is it going to, it's going to be minimal, it's going to be, the ideas I was thinking, I was like, this is going to be boring, isn't it? I mean, old songs are generally not necessarily impenetrable, but something that I've noticed is that old songs, old plays, old literature, you need to do a little bit of work because there's a bit of translation. The language is different, the aesthetics are different, the cultural references are different. And if you're into that can be kind of an enjoyable sort of detective process. But it can make it just kind of boring. And what I've wanted to do with traditional music is actually just make it as immediate as possible, to find the interesting bits and kind of exaggerate them. That's for me as an audience member. That's the kind of thing I enjoy. And I really started to notice it while thinking about this track. I was thinking about going with the Johnny Cash angle. And it occurred to me, maybe I was actually kind of taking the wrong lesson from using those late Johnny Cash albums as a reference. Yeah, they're minimal, but maybe that's not so much the point. They're also just kind of epic and kind of, the key word for me is iconic. If you think about a song like God's Gonna Cut You Down, or The Man Comes Around, or his version of Hurt, or Personal Jesus, or any of those kind of big songs from those later albums, they're iconic. They've got this kind of Johnny Cash epic nature to them. And I realized yesterday, that's what appealed to me about doing traditional music in the first place. I really started getting interested in traditional music when I was about 30, and I was already a huge Tom Waits fan by that point. Tom Waits is probably my biggest musical hero. And when I started discovering traditional music, I felt like, you know what, it'd be great to do some of that Tom Waits
iconic, epic sound using traditional music. And it's something that I've always been leaning towards, but there's this sort of tricky balance to make, because when you're doing traditional music, when you're doing music where, you know, it's written by someone else a long time ago, you know, us people that adapt traditional material, we're all nerds, and the historical accuracy becomes this real temptation. You know, everything you change, you sort of you feel the need to explain yourself. Oh, you know, I know that technically it wouldn't be this, but I'm gonna. And over the years, and I have been doing this for years and years and years, I've started to lean more towards the idea of trying to approach traditional music in the way that Hollywood approaches historical stories. Kind of exaggerated, kind of overblown, kind of epic, kind of iconic. And a really good example of this is there's this TV series called Black Sails. If you didn't see it, it was essentially Game of Thrones with pirates. Just overblown, campy, Toby Stevens, like trashy, just the kind of thing I would enjoy if I had a bit more time. The music for it is fantastic, by a composer called Bear McCreary, which is a great name. I'm sure there's a Kurt Russell film with that as a character. And on the soundtrack for this TV series, the composer Bear McCreary did a version of a very well-known traditional English tune, Parson's Farewell. And it starts off quite trad, and it becomes this big, overblown kind of metal track. And I heard that and I thought, this is what Hollywood is so good at and doesn't maybe get enough credit for. It, like, the dial is just turned up, it's just exaggerated, but it is still pretty, you know, historically accurate. I've got the mandolin here. So it starts off with this kind of kind of delicate traditional mandolin playing, and then it just ends up with this bam, you know, epic guitars, epic drums. It's a lot of fun, and it's the kind of thing, it's not what I want for all the traditional music I do, but it's something I have been kind of missing. All of that to say, let's come back to this question of why did I pick this particular song? I read the lyrics, I got a sense of the story, and I just thought, this feels kind of iconic. This feels kind of gothic. This feels kind of glamorous in a weird way. And I'm very sort of cautious about saying this, because with a lot of these broadside songs, when they are writing about crime or tragedy, they're often based on true stories. And even if they're true stories a few hundred years ago, if you lean into the glamour of that, like, it was a real person's life. And to me, it feels a little bit disrespectful. So, yeah, which is a very long way of me saying, when I'm thinking about adapting this, maybe minimalism is not so much the point. Maybe being iconic is more interesting to me. And being minimal can be a really important component of being iconic. But maybe it's not important to be stripped down. And certainly maybe it's not important to be authentic, historically accurate, which is what I will always default to. Maybe it's important to just have a bit of fun with this. Just turn the dial up. Just make it a bit like gothic and overblown, which is, you know, secretly where my heart is. I mean, I kind of want to turn these songs into pop songs, and this is a source of tension on the local folk scene, because probably less so now, as I think people have got more used to the stuff that I do, but certainly to begin with, when I would bring pop music into a lot of the traditional stuff I was doing, people would be like, look, we're doing folk music to get away from pop music. Why are you bringing it here? But I'm more interested in the history than in the folkiness, I guess. And I do find that one of the best ways to put history in art is to dial it up. So, yeah, I think maybe it's time to just get back to a bit of glam folk. Okay, so I mentioned I had this epiphany about how maybe I was getting too bogged down with being historically accurate. In fact, actually, let's go back further. I mentioned I haven't adapted any trad material for ages. And there's been a lot of ideas brewing of when I get back to it, I'm going to do things differently. And actually, I think I use the word epiphany, but there's a lot of kind of groundwork that's been building up to this. And in terms of, all right, stop getting carried away with historical authenticity that's producing results you don't like. Cool. Okay, so that's a good abstract concept, but really this becomes a real tangible thing when you start to write the tune and the chord sequence, which kind of go together. Now, with some traditional material, you have the tune. With a lot of broadsides, you don't. There's usually like some tune floating around. I mentioned that the Unfortunate Rake is the name of an Irish tune, and possibly that's the tune for the Unfortunate Lad, which is the English broadside. But I don't want to go down that route. I don't want to go with an old-fashioned sounding tune. This feels like a new epiphany. It's actually part of the same epiphany. I'm going to try and demonstrate what I mean, because when I started writing, I started doing the same old thing. I didn't have a tune, but I thought I would write a tune that sounded like the traditional tunes. So I started out with something kind of in a Dorian scale, if you want to be technical. And it was when I was writing that I was like, this is where it gets boring. This is where the song kind of slips out from under me. But I sort of felt like, well, this is kind of how it's done. And then I thought, I'll try something different. And I ended up rewriting it, and I was so glad that I did. And I started mulling on like why I'd gone with that very traditional sound and what problem I had with it, because I do have a problem with it. And I think one of the key things is every fucking traditional song, every traditional English song sounds like that. That's fundamentally the problem. I'm not entirely sure why. Initially, I thought maybe a lot of these songs were written or performed on instruments that were, tended to be in a particular key. Now I think no, because they were kind of done a cappella. I think maybe people would sing them to all sorts of different tunes, but the standard tune, and sometimes the one that's referenced underneath the title in the broadside ballad, can be played with just 2 chords. Okay, so what I'm going to try and demonstrate is there's this particular kind of tune which can be sung over just 2 chords. And I wonder if it was written deliberately so that people could play along if they only knew 2 chords, perhaps on a cittern or kind of proto guitar or something. So I'm just taking the song I mentioned earlier.
Ransom will roar like true British sailors. Ransom will roar all on the salt seas until we reach soundings in the channel of old England. From Ashen to Scilly, it's 35 leagues.
You find a lot of songs like that, and I actually never do just 2 chords because I'm a maximalist and I can't help it. I'm getting treatment. But I wonder if that's why they were written that way. And every once in a while, that's fine. And I've done songs with those kinds of melodies in the past, which sort of makes sense because they're so common. And if you want to reflect the sound of the times, that's the sound to go for. But if you want to make your songs distinctive, coherent, and sound good, you're cutting your legs off at the knees with this, because every song sounds the same. Every song has the same emotion. And actually that emotion kind of works for Young Man Cut Down on His Prime, but it just sounds like every other song. And that was when I was writing the tune and I was doing it that same old way. I did just think this is just going to turn out like everything else. And then, like, how do you do that and be minimal when the melody, the chords, the kind of building blocks of the song are just so generic? How do you make it minimal but yet distinctive? So I ended up coming up with something different. I'm actually in D minor, not E minor. I'm going to go with this chord sequence, which is much more of a sort of pop song. maybe kind of like mid 20th century pop song, but still. And I realized that's what I want. And the reason is because I can put more specific emotion in that. That has got an emotion which for me fits these lyrics better and makes the song more interesting. I was remembering when I was writing this, folk singer Chris Drever, often well known in the band Lau, he was one of the people who I noticed was doing traditional songs but writing his own chords and melody. And I thought I should do that because it sounds so much better. So yeah, I'm going to do that. Okay, here's a really typical part of my writing process. So I found a melody and a chord sequence for the song that I liked, and I recorded it just on the iPad, and then I started developing it more, and I moved it to Logic Pro, the kind of main studio program that I use. I developed it more. I recorded a draft vocal part. I recorded some, draft instrument parts. I basically fleshed it out. I moved the verses and choruses around. I worked out what went where. I got essentially a demo finished. And I really got it finished last night. And when I finished, I was left with a sense of, this is boring. This is just kind of lifeless and plodding. It sounds to me like this is a 150-year-old song that someone has taken and adapted and tried to modernize, and it's quite interesting, but it's not something I would listen to for pleasure. It's bloodless. It's not telling a story. It doesn't have really any emotion to it. And so I went to sleep obsessing about that and just thinking about, okay, what is it that needs changing? What other songs do something similar that other people have done? What are they getting right that I'm getting wrong? What do I need to change? And I thought, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to do a little bit to camera on this and explain this kind of process. So that's my kind of take now, except that just before I got the phone out to record, I thought I should listen to the song and see if I still think that it sounds dull. And I just listened to it now and I'm like, no, it sounds good. And again, this is such a typical thing to happen. It doesn't sound great. It does sound like a demo, but the difference between hearing it now and hearing it at the end of the session I was working on last night is that now I'm like, okay, I could tweak that and I can see how I can improve this, and this needs changing and that needs changing. Like I can, and also I sort of get a sense of all right, the basic idea is good. There's a lot of tidying up to do and a lot of kind of finessing. Whereas last night I just felt like the basic idea just wasn't working. And it comes back to this really crucial thing for me of the importance of perspective and why, for me, doing long creative sessions, like 4, 5, 6 hours at a time, generally produces a bad result. Now, that's not to say that I can't do a lot of creative work in a day, but if it's in one block, I lose perspective. And when I lose perspective and start to not really see the point of the thing that I'm working on, I just start making bad decisions because I don't know which direction I'm going in. And so for me, one of the most effective ways of working is having more than one project on the go at the same time. So when something just feels boring, when something feels like it's not working, swap it out for something else, or just sleep on it and then come back later. And it's amazing how often, just with a fresh perspective, I can see that, all right, yeah, the project still doesn't work yet, but I can see where to take it next. Oh, and one more thing. While I was obsessing about why this demo wasn't working last night as I was going to sleep, I got one of those ideas that come just as you're falling asleep and you're like, do I get out of bed and make a note of it? And I just thought, I'll try and remember. It's an idea for the video. The singer singing the song, presumably me, in the middle of singing, just randomly gets a nosebleed. I don't know why this completely captures the emotion that I want the song to create, but it does. So yeah, ideas that come to you when they really shouldn't and you just need to sleep. Let's talk about minimalism. I mentioned that I felt like this was a song that could have a kind of a similar sort of minimal aesthetic to the late Johnny Cash albums. I've got to this point where I've recorded a lot of the track now. I've done the main vocals, I've put some bouzouki mandolin parts down, some kind of string parts down. I think I've got an understanding of what the drums are going to sound like. I've done a lot to it. It is not minimal. Like when it gets to the end, I think it started with adding a harmony vocal, but I've added this enormous orchestral brass that just kicks in, and it's just enormous and a bit kind of Phil Spector. And I finished it and I mulled on it, and I just then thought, oh yeah, I was going to try and be, can I not do minimalism? Is that the thing? Am I just like incapable of doing it? Because I have tried to do, I've tried to write in a minimal way since I was a teenager, and that was a long time ago, and I've never really been able to do it. I've always found myself adding parts and feeling like, okay, well maybe this track isn't going to be a minimal track. Maybe I'll save that for another time. And like, I just don't feel like I'm actually able to do it. So it's been this mini sort of existential crisis, which kind of feeds into some kind of wider insecurities about like, why is it that I'm just always so extra, like so sort of over the top, and so often in situations find I'm trying to kind of like dial the emotion down to fit in with being normal. So yeah, it kind of feeds into that. But when I thought about it and thought, maybe this is something I'll talk about, it did occur to me, sometimes just kind of consciously acknowledging it made me think, this is not about me, this is about the track. Does the track need to be minimal? If it does, make it minimal. If it benefits from being overblown and extra, and if every track I do is massively over the top, then cool, that's my sound and that's fine. If that's the best way of doing it. It's only if I listen back to the song and think, you know what, it would be so much better if I just took out this part, this part, this part, and this part. So that's really what I'm grappling with at the moment. And it's a tricky one. I don't know whether or not this track is going to benefit from being minimal. On the one hand, there's a kind of an elegance and a stylishness that comes with being minimal. If you've got like maybe the greatest example of a recent totally minimal track, Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes. It's so iconic, and if you added more stuff to it, you'd be subtracting from it. So it can be a really stylish thing, but if there isn't enough going on in the song, or in the case of a traditional song, if it's old enough that it doesn't really translate comfortably into modern language, and you need to do stuff to make it so you're not just putting all of the work on your audience. If it needs that, then maybe minimalism is not the right approach. There is this kind of tension as well between being minimal and being boring. And if you are an artist who primarily cares about being cool and being fashionable, it sounds like a shitty way of putting it, but there's nothing wrong with that. I've got, plenty of soft spots for plenty of fashion music artists. If that's your thing, then it's better to be boring than it is to be over the top. It's better to be boring than it is to be cliched. It's better to be boring than it is to be pretentious. It's better to be boring than it is to look like an idiot. I'm at the other end of that spectrum. I would much rather be cliched, pretentious, all of the above, than be boring. Boring for me is the unforgivable sin. In my own music, if I come back to something and I find that it's pretentious, I'm like, that's embarrassing, I should avoid doing that again. If it's boring, I question my existence. So, should this track be minimal? Well, it occurs to me that what I need to do in order to actually see if this track can work as being minimal is just add a lot more stuff. Which sounds counterintuitive. But there's this musical approach by Brian Eno. Brian Eno, if you're not familiar with his work, really influential music producer and musician in his own right. He kind of started the whole genre of ambient music, arguably. But he had this approach where you just add stuff and 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 just add anything that kind of sounds good. And then when you can't think of any more things to add, you start taking things away, take them out, take them out, take them out. And if you reach a point where you're taking stuff out and the whole thing is sounding worse. Now, in terms of sounding worse, it might still sound good with a ton of stuff in it, but the overblown nature of it might conflict with the subject matter of the song. The song might just work better if it's more stripped down. I think that's where I've run into problems in the past. I've got it sounding good to my ears, but maybe it just doesn't suit the words and the subject matter. So yeah, that's what I'm going to try. I'm going to try just thinking of anything that sounds good, piling it on, maybe sitting on it for a little bit. That's just occurred to me, actually. That is probably going to make sense. I should make it as big and as epic as possible, and then just leave it and work on something else for a few days, and then come back to it, and then kind of approach the track from scratch, I think. Bit by bit, this mix is starting to come together. I'm adding bits, tweaking them. It's progressively sounding less and less shit, I think. And now I'm really starting to think about the big question of how minimal do I want to be? And this really comes down to, I think I've added these big orchestral horns in the last couple of choruses, and it sounds completely over the top in a way that I like. I feel like it works. And in the past, I would have just gone with that. But this feels like one of the first times where I've actually asked the question, okay, sure, this works, but would taking them out work even better? Would actually dialing it down and being a bit more restrained carry more emotion with it? Because I now feel like often I go for the loud explosions rather than the intimate close-up, which can pack more of a punch. So that's the question I've been wondering. And I'm leaning more towards the loud explosions, surprise, surprise. But I think the reason for that, I mentioned before about the tension I feel between minimalism and, being boring, being elegant and stripped down, and just there's nothing really going on. That kind of tension. I would still like to be better at being minimal and being able to say things with less. But I liked the dialed up aspect of those later Johnny Cash songs more than the dialed down aspect. And I feel like the way that this young man cut down in his prime has started to shape with these big drums right from the beginning makes me feel like that is the emotion that's kind of baked into the song already. I feel like I could dial everything else down. I could take out those orchestral horns and it would work. But I feel like, no, I do think this is a track that wants to be a bit OTT. Maybe not, maybe that's just my natural OTT nature. But then, hey, I mean, maybe that's not a terrible thing. Maybe, I'm the person you go to for the OTT, who knows? I might change my mind on this. I'm still playing with the mix and still kind of polishing it, I think. But yeah, that's where I'm leaning at the moment. Next thing for me to do is to start figuring out collaborations. I think I want to add some bagpipes. So I'll talk, I think, either to Joe, who said he might be able to help on that, or to Joel, and we'll see how that goes. I'm thinking of kind of squirrel on the boat. I'm thinking, which is kind of like snakes on a plane, but it's much more English and small scale. God, my brain is in a funny place today. What was I talking about? Yeah, I'm thinking of kind of asking people if they want to stop by, just recording a load of takes and then pulling bits out and seeing what works. Yeah. I'll let you know how that goes. Okay, so as I mentioned, I kind of randomly press ganged my friend Joe at a drunken session. I said, would you fancy playing bagpipes on this track I'm doing for a YouTube video? And he was like, yeah, sure. What's weird is that I then got in touch with him. Actually, I saw him at a session after that and mentioned it. And he was like, yeah, no, I'm still up for it. So clearly, he wasn't just completely wasted. So that's good. Joe is going to come and play bagpipes in a couple of days. I'm just trying to prep everything. And there's a number of challenges. The first challenge is I don't want to waste Joe's time. I've said, it'll take an hour. That's all it's going to take. And that's just as well, because that's the only time I have in between childcare at the moment. So We need to turn up. I'll probably offer him a cup of tea, and then we just need to get as many takes as possible. I suggested Joe just improvise, and then I'll piece it all together afterwards. So timing is really going to be a factor. What I do not want to happen is me to kind of turn up, get my laptop set up, get everything kind of plug in the microphones, and then be like, oh, that's weird. It didn't do that while I was testing it. I need a setup that's going to have as few moving parts as possible, even if that means more of a headache later when I get the sound files. So that's the first challenge and my first approach for it. Second challenge is probably more significant. If you want a horror story, try Googling or YouTubing how to record bagpipes in a studio. Do you know how loud bagpipes are? There's a reason why they use them on battlefields. Like, they are so loud. And they've got like a billion different sound sources as well. Like, the sound comes out of here and here and here and here and here. So it's a bit of a challenge in terms of like miking them up. Where do you put the microphone? I haven't mic'd bagpipes before, so I need to figure out some incredibly simple way of getting the best sound I'm likely to get. Also, it's going to be in here on this boat. Now, one of the great things about a boat with a kind of wooden interior is that the wood is going to hopefully deaden the sound and mean you don't get all these wild rogue frequencies bouncing all over the place and causing phase issues. But it's still not an acoustically treated room. It's still probably going to sound kind of boxy once it's done. I'm just hoping that's going to be okay and that's going to fit with the aesthetic of the track, because I'm not going to ask Joe to come back if it doesn't work. If I haven't nailed it, I haven't nailed it. I really kind of get one shot at this. So, how to record it? What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this. This is a Zoom H1N. This is a really kind of basic handheld recorder. This is the kind of thing, you know, journalists will use when recording interviews. This is not going to be plugged into my laptop. It's not going to be plugged into my digital audio workstation. You know, I'm not going to be able to kind of put it directly in the mix. I'm going to record individual sound files and then have to put them in and then sync them up with the music. Joe is just going to listen to the track on headphones. And so, yeah, I don't have any kind of synchronization thing set up. Like I said, that's more of a headache for afterwards, but there's just a lot fewer moving parts with this. It could break. You never know. Experience tells me it could just like explode. It could just, you know, destroy the world. But hopefully it should be fine. I've got a couple of spare batteries. I'm hoping again that this can take the volume. It's a stereo microphone. It's not great for recording in detail. It's not great for getting like the full rich sort of bass frequencies. This is just creating an ambience in a space. And because bagpipes are so loud, I'm not worrying about subtlety. I'm not worrying about getting in there and getting the details. I might regret that. Who knows? So yeah, that's my approach. That may work, it may not. Like I say, I've kind of got one shot to do it, but I guess we'll see. Now that I think about it, collaborating is a part of this process that I was kind of dreading, because it's not in my control. You know, you've got to deal with other people and other people's schedules. So I booked a session with Joe to record the bagpipe part. We only had an hour and he just nailed it and just made everything easy. He turned up with a guitar case on his back with 3 different sets of bagpipes in. And he sat down and he said, okay, from what you've been talking about, as in, like, he said this to me, from what you've been talking about, it seems like the thing you really want to nail is this solo section, the kind of instrumental bit. Let's just do that first. Let's just do a few takes until you feel like you've got what you want. Then why don't I just record a drone and you can sample that and do whatever you want with it. And then, depending on how much time we've got, let's just go back to the beginning and I'll just play along and improvise all the way through again and again until we run out of time. And that's what he did. And a good example of how Joe made everything easy is, it sort of hadn't occurred to me. He was just about to pack up and he was like, hey, take a picture of the pipes for the YouTube video. So collaborations, yeah, they can be a pain in the ass to organize. They weren't at all in this case. And they can just bring so much that you couldn't do yourself. Not only could I not play the instrument, I couldn't have got that kind of atmosphere, which I did feel like this track needed. I felt like it needed pipes. Pipes are referenced in the lyrics, but also it just felt right. And I'm so happy with the result. I haven't gone in and actually pieced his takes together and built something out of it, but This is how you can tell if you're a recording nerd. I cannot wait to take all of these different takes, line them all up, get them all cut and edited and crafted and polished. I love doing that. So yeah, collaborations, yay. So let's give this a little bit of a mix walkthrough then. What have we got? A lot of these sounds are samples rather than actual instruments recorded through a microphone. I'll explain why I've lent in that direction for this track. But first of all, I'll just kind of go through the tracks. Got some timpani samples. That was what I started with, this kind of ba-da-ba-da-dum, kind of big epic sound. And I thought, okay, that's fine, bit melodramatic. Where's it actually going to go? And then I added this military snare, and I was like, okay, those two work together. I think I can see which direction this is going in. I've got some various kind of percussion sounds here of these various things. I think the tambourine is the only thing that's actually a live instrument, but I might be wrong on that. Another riser, another kind of rising sound. Reverse cymbal, have I used that? I muted that, maybe that didn't come out in the final thing. Bass, how do you fill up the bass frequencies when you're doing a traditional track? Because there weren't that many portable instruments that were good at bass. Those were things like tuba, but there were some. There were some kind of reed instruments that had a bit more of the kind of bottom end to them. And there's actually, I think, a medieval instrument called a racket, which is, as far as I can tell, and I've never actually seen one in the flesh, but it's tiny. It's sort of shaped like a little kind of square, but it just makes this as a real crunchy kind of analog keyboard sound. I was sort of leaning towards that. What I've actually got here, if you have a look at it, is I've got bassoon samples, and I'm mixing that with sine wave bass, because bassoon, it's got that low reedy sound, but it doesn't actually have the bass frequencies I need. So I blended them in with just a very pure sine wave. So that was how I solved that problem. There's a lead vocal, there's a harmony vocal. Both of them got a fair bit of stuff on, because I generally don't plug in with preamps. I generally just plug, this was a condenser mic rather than the last track I did, which was like a dynamic, like the kind of mic you'd have on stage. This is much more of a studio mic, but even so, yeah, I don't use preamps. It's all in here, so there's usually a lot of plugins on the vocals. What else have we got? Bouzouki panned left, mandolin, it's a mandolin part panned on the right. Concertina, I've got concertina and accordion here. Concertina is like I'm doing sort of like 2 or 3 notes, forming essentially more of a percussion track. That's played live on what I call my Fisher-Price concertina. Concertinas are the little things you have with kind of both hands. Accordion is much more of the bigger thing that covers your whole chest. I could have asked a friend and I could have used a keyboard accordion, but these are samples. And this is why I will tend to use samples of instruments, even if I've got the instrument. If it's doing more of a percussive or basic accompaniment part, if it's not drawing attention to itself, which this accordion isn't, I don't want to go to all the trouble of getting it mic'd and making sure there's no noise happening outside and getting a really good sound, only for it, when it's in the mix with everything else going on, to still probably not sound as good as the samples. So in terms of what it sounds like to me as a listener, samples make sense most of the time, but not for the bagpipes. So this was the fantastic job that Joe did. I mentioned this already, but he came in with a clear idea of what it was I wanted. And he was like, okay, how about this option, this option, this option, this. He just did a load of takes. And I put a bunch of them together. I put 3 of them together here. And yeah, that's a real case of samples weren't going to cut it. You know, that's an instrument that sounds like a human voice, and you want all that nuance in there. You know, you don't want to take that out with samples. And actually, what did I put on here? What kind of... See, this is interesting, all right? Oh, this is interesting to me, at least. Because the bagpipes are so loud, I wanted something that was just going to capture the room rather than get up close and capture the kind of intricacies of the bagpipe. So I just had this Zoom H1 pretty far away. And looking at it now, I've put a little bit of pitch correction on just to tidy it up a bit. I've put compression on one of these 2. Other than that, I just haven't touched them. This is just the sound of the bagpipe in that room in the boat. So yeah, that came out really nicely. I can't remember what reverb I did. I did the CLA Epic. This is Chris Lord-Alge. He's one of the big rock music mixers, and he's got this pack of his favorite reverbs and delays. And I don't use it for everything, but I think it can be a really useful tool. because you've got a bunch of different things that sit very nicely together. So that will have been the reverb I used for that. What we've got at the end here, I've put a kind of a machine learning plugin that just tidies up a lot of the rogue frequencies that sound weird. I don't put it on every track, but I've clearly put it on here a little bit, not a huge amount, 6%. Virtual tape as usual, and then kind of that. Interesting. Something that I noticed is I haven't done my usual thing of testing. Did I even test whether or not there were any phase issues? I might not have done that. And it looks like I didn't test the tone balance, whether or not there's kind of more bass or more treble or more whatever than there would usually be. And it looks like I haven't tested the dynamic range, how squashed it is, which I would normally do on every track. It also looks like I haven't tested it in different sonic environments, what it would sound like in different rooms using the Slate headphones. Clearly, I couldn't be asked. Maybe I was in a hurry, who knows? But I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, let's say that's it. All right, a curious little thing happened at the session. I often find it a little bit difficult to explain what my sort of master of ceremonies job is. I've just literally come in from New Year's Eve, 2023 to 2024. And we had like a tiny incident, but it just made me realize, oh yeah, this is the thing that I get nervous about beforehand, but that sort of falls into my kind of purview, I guess. So it was a pretty busy night. It's kind of quite enthusiastic crowd, and there were a bunch of people who all clearly knew each other. And in the middle of one of the tune sets, a fairly short, kind of good-looking gentleman stepped into the middle, picked up a tambourine and started just really kind of going for it in a very particular way, which is slightly doing the sort of the taking the piss folk river dance thing that teenagers do, this kind of this thing. And on the one hand, like, the purpose of the evening is for everyone to have a good time. So like, I don't want to be a dick about it, but I could tell that like his mates thought it was hilarious. All of the folk musicians were uncomfortable by it. And that's the kind of thing that it's my job to resolve. So we were playing and he's doing this and he's kind of doing tambourine and whatever. And I was like, I need to find a way to kind of bring the room back. And I was like, okay, I know what to say. So we finished the tune set. There was a big cheer from his friends. There was a big cheer for everyone else. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Radcliffe. And we got the room back. And that's the kind of important thing. Like, the job is to create a space where musicians feel comfortable and they know that the person running it is going to kind of have their back, I guess. So, excuse my mental blank, because I'm drunk and it's New Year's Eve. But yeah, I didn't want to be a dick about it, but I just wanted to establish to that crowd, you know, we want you to have a good time. That's great. But if you take the piss out of us, we're going to take the piss out of you. And there's more of us than there are of you. Okay, yeah, so there's been a lot of new ideas, and I found myself coming back to the question of what is the song about again? You know, is it just about a vibe? Is it just about a gothic atmosphere? And I started thinking about that gothic atmosphere thing. And I thought, well, one of the things that I find so appealing about all things gothic is reminding you of your mortality. Which is odd that I find that comforting, but like that's why heavy metal is a thing, I think. And I was thinking about that, and then I suddenly thought, oh yeah, this song is what's known in art as a memento mori, something which, like often a sculpture, often a religious sculpture, often part of a tune, which is meant to remind passers-by that life is transient and precious. And I thought, well, yeah, if the song is kind of a memento mori, that's something to lean into for the video. That feels to me like a central visual theme. There are memento moris are such a huge part of art, particularly in the more kind of medieval side. So yeah, that'll be a starting point, I think, for how the video is going to look. How I'm going to interpret that, I've got no idea. But yeah, it feels like an interesting starting point. I think I'm starting to piece together kind of a formula for coming up with music video ideas. It starts with this question, where's the movement? What's moving? You know, for example, in the last song I did, already onto the next thing, I was trying to think like, what kind of movement is going to work? And it occurred to me, oh, this is a car journey. This is somebody sitting in a car on a phone conversation. With Young Man Cut Down on His Prime, I felt like, okay, this is a kind of slow, dark, ominous movement. I felt like this is a funeral procession. And so that became the sort of starting point idea. And I've explored that a lot using generative AI, but I felt like in order to anchor it, I needed to have a performance. I needed to have me singing to camera. And I was thinking how to do that. Well, I thought, okay, maybe if the funeral procession takes place in my hometown in Oxford, Oxford can once again be like the set. So I thought that would work. And I thought, okay, if I'm going to do a performance, maybe it makes sense for me to stand by one of the city walls, because the city walls here are like 800 years old and it looks kind of dramatic. So I thought, okay, cool. I'll just try and nip into town and then somehow film myself performing, mime along, whatever. Yeah, fine in principle. As I came to actually plan that, I was thinking about like, where am I going to stand? And I thought, well, okay, I have got such a small amount of time. I get like an hour here and there, and really not more than an hour. I need to get to town. I would need to find somewhere I can put a camera, find somewhere I can have playback that I can mime to, and not be distracted by the fact there's people walking back and forth. Oxford is a major tourist destination in the UK all year round. That's just not, it's not practical. It's not going to work. So I thought, okay, right, maybe I need to come in here and do green screen. So that's what I did. I went to town, I took some photos of the city walls, and then hoped I could match the lighting. And there, I mean, I got a result I think is okay, but it's not great. I'm realizing I've still got a lot to learn in terms of green screen. So for example, in order to try and match the light, I just had the windows of the boat open and had natural light, which seemed to make sense. I'm only now starting to appreciate how much light you need to do green screen, because you need the right ISO, you need the right shutter speed. These things are really important, and these things need light. So I'll have to kind of figure that out for next time. But I also made the decision, all right, if I'm going to be on the boat, I'm going to dress up a bit. I'll get my old Border Morris band outfit. That's not something I would have really been comfortable standing in public doing, even though I've done it for years, in the full get-up. So anyway, long story short, still a lot more to learn about green screen, I feel. I've been using quite a lot of generative AI recently, and as a result, I'm starting to get the opinions, particularly informed by what I think is a fantastic video on the Verge YouTube channel. The Verge is a tech news site, you're probably aware of it, which I think is doing the cutting edge news on generative AI. This video is about a German artist called Boris Eldagsen, who did a generative AI photo and entered it into a Sony Photography Award and won, and then gave the award back. I think this was trying to make a statement about AI. The video really helped me solidify how I feel about the use of generative AI in art. There's kind of two sides to it. There's like how it's going to impact artists, and then there's how it's going to impact the commercial side. I want to just talk about where I think the commercial side is going at the moment, and this is mainly influenced by the Verge reporting. I think a lot of it is going to depend on how the law goes in terms of IP infringement, and a lot of that's going to depend on where politics goes. But I wouldn't be surprised if in the short term, the law basically says to creators, come and join the taxi drivers, you've just been Ubered. You have no rights and protections, you are now part of the gig economy. That wouldn't hugely surprise me, but all it would take, I think, is for somebody to then take a Disney character intended for children and then make some kind of viral, very adult content with it. Then the company that enables that is not only going to get sued by Disney, but they're also going to face the wrath of enraged parents who vote. So I can see that there's going to be some kind of legislation at some point. It might well be legislation that just protects major film studios and record labels, who knows. But yeah, commercial side, it's kind of a minefield. In terms of art and whether or not it has a place in art, this Berlin artist, Boris Eldagsen, his take that really resonated with me is, it's interesting. Generative AI art is interesting if you think of it as a different art form. Not as a tool for making art, but like a whole different art form. It's not photography, it's not videography, it's not painting, it's not whatever. He described himself as like a promptographer, which sounds a bit gimmicky, but if you've got a philosophy you're trying to put across, fair enough, I think. Underlying that, I feel like the thing that really resonated with me is the idea that generative AI art is interesting if I know, it's interesting to me if I know that it's generative AI art, and it is not interesting to me if I don't. It's got a little bit of a sort of bad smell about it. If I'm struggling to tell the difference between what's real here, there's an element of deceptiveness to it. Now, when you're talking about like a Hollywood movie, you've got this tricky balance between art and commercial, and I can understand there's all sorts of grey areas there. But in terms of what I'm making, it made me realise I feel a lot more comfortable using generative AI art if I label very clearly, this is generative AI art. I've also mentioned the last time I talked about AI art here, it's kind of on me to make sure I don't rip off other people. And that was another point that this guy made in the Verge video. His point, I think, was that it needs to be art. You know, you need to have actually, he said he'll go through like 30 different layers of prompts and blending with other images and this sort of thing. And I think that's an important thing too. Otherwise, it's not really an art form. It's just kind of a magic trick. It's just not a magic trick. It's kind of a technological gimmick. I mean, wow, what a gimmick, but still a gimmick. So yeah, that really stuck with me, this idea of it needs to be art, you need to actually do something interesting and imaginative with it, but also you need to establish, you need to let the audience know you're looking at generative AI art, and that way it's easier to kind of understand what you are looking at is a machine learning computer system which has mashed together all of this culture and all this humanity and then created something extraordinary, sometimes extraordinary good, sometimes extraordinary weird and frightening. But yeah, that's an interesting thing to explore, I think. But again, I feel like it's important to really broadcast this is generative AI. And I came across an interesting little test of this for myself. When making this video, I was using Midjourney and I was using a lot of reference images from the Victorian era or early 20th century. And I put the first edit together and there were a couple of gaps and I felt like, all right, I need something to go here. And I felt like I need a young woman's face who's going to sort of fit with the time period of where the video is landing. And so I did a bit of Googling and I came across the stage and screen actress Maud Feely, which is a fantastic name. And she just had the right look that I was looking for. There were lots of photos of her that were in the public domain. And I thought I could take one of these photos and I could put this in the video. This kind of image right here, this is sort of what I'm looking for. And I was sort of starting to do that and I thought, oh no, this is the thing I want to avoid. This is blurring real life with generative AI. I want this video, the bits that aren't just me performing, to just be a generative AI space. And I feel uncomfortable with that kind of blurring of it. So yeah, that's where I'm at the moment. My views may change completely because this technology is still kind of working itself out and I feel we're all working out how we feel about it. But yeah, I thought that was interesting.
You make a compelling point.
Okay, I'm going to kind of mess with my own format here because usually the way that these videos work is I'll do sort of broad conclusions at the end. The first part will be, is the video finished? And I'll talk about the kind of finishing touches to that. I'll talk about what went well. I'll talk about what went badly. I'll talk about what I learned. Then there'll be brief finishing up and then we go into the video. The thing is, for this video, for Young Man Cut Down on His Prime, this section of what I've learned, which comes just before the music video, I have got so much to say about it. And I don't want to just kind of tease the video, and then just go on a long rant right before it and just push it out into the distance. So I thought I'd skip things around and I'm going to talk about what I've learned now. I assumed that this particular episode was going to be about me coming back to doing traditional music and all the things I find exciting about it. But more specifically, I thought it was going to be about how cultures change over time, the intersection of the past and the present, you know, double standards and sexual politics, fleeting mortality, all of these things. For me, this episode wasn't about that at all. The one thing that just sort of overshadowed everything is generative AI art, which has just blown my fucking mind backwards. I have fallen in love with it. I am fascinated by it. But it is this kind of hornet's nest of ethical and legal issues. At the moment, at least. So let's talk about it. Let's start with the problems first. I really like Midjourney. I really enjoy using it, but I am uncomfortable about it. Now, when I first started using it, one of the things I really enjoyed doing was putting in prompts in the style of someone. Well, not someone, Hayao Miyazaki, over and over again. That was the thing, because I'm such a fan of his and I'm such a fan of his visual style and I can't draw. That was the thing I kind of really played with. I now feel like that shouldn't be a feature that we can do. There isn't any intellectual property protection over people's identity and style. There hasn't been because there hasn't sort of needed to be, perhaps. But with deepfakes and with this kind of generative AI art, I feel like there should be. This is something that I've really kind of come to the conclusion of. I mentioned I watched that video from The Verge. That video on Boris Eldegson has really been kind of sitting with me. And I've really been trying to figure out, the thing about Midjourney is, I think it's fair enough at the moment that they haven't got all the kind of IP stuff sorted out because this is new technology, the law hasn't been made. I am expecting, I'm kind of hoping, there's, well, maybe this is a bit of a naive hope, but I'm hoping there's going to be some good IP law that's going to be passed either in the States or in Europe or whatever that's going to basically kind of set the standard. I'm hoping that Midjourney is going to be able to incorporate that and make sure that it's not just a tool for ripping people off. If it isn't, I'm quite happy to jump to a platform that's just going to do AI models based on assets that they own. I know Getty is working on one. I know Adobe is working on one. I don't have any particular loyalty to Midjourney in that sense. I enjoy using it, but I don't want to end up getting sued and I don't want to rip off other artists. So that's something that needs to be figured out. This is kind of the big problem, I feel. It is this whole thing of IP and taking other people's work. For the first video that I did, the Uptown Funk video, I did do images in the style of someone else. It was a new tool. I hadn't quite had time to really think about the implications of that. And I sort of wish I hadn't done that. And yeah, I don't intend on doing it again. For this video, for Young Man Cut Down on His Prime, because it's all kind of set in the past, I've been able to use imagery based on photographs that are long since in the public domain, long since out of copyright. So I haven't kind of felt bad about that. For the previous video, for Already On to the Next Thing, it's a bit more complicated because I was coming up against the limitations of Midjourney. For example, like one of the images that I wanted was burning planes falling out of the sky. So I would say to Midjourney, can you give me burning planes falling out of the sky? And Midjourney would be like, yep, no problem. Here you go, a burning plane falling out of the sky. And I'd be like, yep, cool. Can you give me like burning planes plural? And Midjourney would be like, I'm sorry? I'd be like, plural, as in like more than one. And Midjourney would be like, is this more than one? And I'd be like, no, that's still just one. Is this more than one? No, that's still just one. And then Midjourney would be like, well, I mean, the problem is I haven't really seen a great deal of photos where there's more than one burning plane falling. It's just not something you really get. So I don't quite know how to go about this. So what I've had to do is educate it by giving it reference images of things that are sort of visually similar so it can work out how to do that. And I've been using images that are in copyright. And actually, I haven't had a problem doing that because for me, this is the process of using references. And as far as I'm aware, everyone who does art professionally or semi-professionally uses references. Like if you're doing this stuff regularly, you just need to be able to use references to kind of figure out how other people have done it. It's something I do all the time when making production music. And the key thing is with this particular project of music videos, I do not want the result to look anything like the reference. I'm just using it in a very specific way. But I'm also aware of the fact that this whole idea of, oh, you know, we're not actually infringing other people's rights. We're just teaching people. It's in a way, it's like, you know, you wouldn't sue somebody for learning how to draw like Hayao Miyazaki. I don't buy that as a justification for the whole platform. For specifically using references to get a very different result, cool. But the fact is, I can just kind of use Midjourney to rip off Hayao Miyazaki. And I keep coming back to him because I mentioned him earlier in the last episode about how like that was the first thing I played around with. And it's occurred to me since then, there's kind of an irony to that, that like of all of the people to rip off, I don't think there's anyone on the planet who, I mean, I don't know, but who I imagine likes the idea of generative AI art less than Hayao Miyazaki. His films are about humanity and nature fighting against kind of dehumanizing machines. And there's this great clip in a documentary on Miyazaki where a bunch of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed animators show him the latest in generative AI art, and he just looks and it's like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. This is like anti-human. I've been thinking about that a lot because at the moment Miyazaki's one of my big artistic heroes. It may not seem like there's an obvious translation with music, but I like to get inspiration from other art forms, and Miyazaki's the man. So if he thinks, and I don't know if he thinks this, but if he does think that generative AI art is kind of anti-human, is kind of dehumanizing, maybe he's right. Maybe it's just not something to use at all. A bit straw man here because, like I say, I don't even know if he thinks that. But I've thought a lot about this and I don't feel like, or at least in using it, I've come to the conclusion that it's not dehumanizing. I think that humans are perfectly capable of making dehumanizing machines. I don't feel like these generative AI tools are dehumanizing. I feel like what they're actually all about is a very particular kind of humanity. Now, what this generative AI, what these models are, is basically having scraped, let's just talk about images for a second. The same presumably applies to music and text and whatever else. They've scraped the internet and they're giving you insights into really general behavior, like how humans generally solve these creative problems, how they will make this kind of an image, how they will make this kind of text. And that's what makes them interesting. In that sense, they're not about humans, they're about humanity more generally. And here we start to get to why it is that I'm not just interested in generative AI art, I've kind of fallen in love with it. Before I get into it, I just want to hark back to the thing that I found so interesting from that video from The Verge, the interview with Boris Eldagsen. My takeaway from that was that it's not just a tool, it's a whole art form, and it's only interesting if you know it's generative AI art. Generative AI commercial art, I feel like, is a whole other thing, but in terms of sort of making an artistic statement, at least, it's interesting if you know that it's generative AI art. So, why am I so keen on it? If you had asked me years ago to predict what generative AI art was going to be like, if you told me years ago, there's going to be this new set of tools in the toolbox that will use artificial intelligence, machine learning to create artistic things, and you'd ask me to describe how that was going to work, I think I would have put quite a bit of money on the fact that it would be very good at reproducing details of reality, but it would not be great on reproducing the soul of art, on like atmosphere, on vibes. What I find so fascinating is it's kind of the other way around. Generative AI art is really bad on detail. Midjourney is a good example. Give Midjourney, try and, ask Midjourney to draw a hand, and Midjourney will be like, oh, hands, yeah, okay. Like fingers are a big thing, aren't they? I know this one. All right. How many fingers are there on a hand? Is it like 6, 5? It's that kind of number, isn't it? Midjourney's not great with detail. But if you give Midjourney some sort of really artistic problem, if you say to it, okay, I want the stillness and serenity of a Vermeer painting, but in a hen-do in the back of a limo. Midjourney will be like, sorry, you want what? There you go. And, I'll look at it and be like, how did you do this? I gave you an impossible brief and you solved it in seconds. Now, that may seem kind of dispiriting that it's able to do such a human thing. But when I first started writing songs, like as a kid, I assumed that the best songs were the ones that were political or saying something about society and like big issues. And then I came to the conclusion, you know what? There's other things that do that better. Academia, journalism, that if you want to make that kind of point, music is more interesting in exploring emotion and atmosphere, and the word I'm using a lot, vibes. And it's been trying to kind of explore vibes in music that I felt like I haven't been good enough at doing, that I find difficult. Translating an emotion into an atmosphere is just hard. And to be clear, I don't feel like generative AI art gives me the whole thing, gives me a whole artwork. And I wouldn't be particularly interested if it did. But what it's really good at doing is that specific thing of translating an idea into an atmosphere. I'll give you an example. I use a lot of B-roll of the canals and rivers of Oxford, which is kind of my world. And that's a good way of sort of capturing the atmosphere in B-roll in these videos. But in a music video, it wouldn't be enough. Let's say I wanted a scene which had the perfect sunset in it. Now, as I've said many times, I'm not like a cinematographer, I'm not a videographer, I'm not great with photography. The challenge of me getting a perfect sunset would be, okay, I have to work out when golden hour is, I'd have to pick a day where it's clear sky, I'd have to negotiate childcare, I only have a small amount of time, I'd have to turn up, I'd have to find what camera to use, I don't have expensive cameras at the moment, I'm not interested in expensive cameras, I'd probably mess something up, I probably would under or overexpose it, I wouldn't notice there's something in the frame that kind of ruins it, and even if all of those conditions were right, I'd probably get a sunset that was fine. The thing about Midjourney is if I ask for a perfect sunset, or if I just ask for a sunset, for Midjourney, a perfect sunset is like the default. That's what it will give you unless you ask it not to. It's so influenced by human aesthetics, by what we find appealing. And that I find so fascinating, and that I just love exploring. And this video particularly, Young Man Cut Down on His Prime, has been the thing that just really opened my eyes to, wow, I had a bunch of ideas in my head that I thought would be cool to put in a video. And I was able to nail all of them. I'm just trying to think, there was one little thing in this video that I felt like I couldn't get. And even then I think I found a fix for it. The previous one, already on to the next thing, was a bit more challenging, as I mentioned, kind of running up against the Midjourney barriers. But this video just really struck me. For a song and for a music video that's just about vibes, this is just such a game changer. Now, just to kind of prepare you for this video, I think something you'll notice with all the videos I've done so far, they are amateurish. Like, you're not going to look at them and think this was a professional video made by, you know, a professional video team. You can't see the like thousands or tens of thousands of pounds on the screen. This is clearly a one-man band. I don't mind that. The thing that I want to be able to do is just get a sense of the vibes, of the atmosphere. And I have been absolutely blown away by how much easier generative AI has made it. And I'll again come back to this thing of, I don't feel like I can really relax using this until the IP situation is at least kind of sorted out. It's a big challenge, and lawmaking, I think all around the world at the moment is not exactly a golden age right now. So I don't know, I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that. But I think it's coming down to the fact that my take on generative AI is, for the very particular thing that it does, it's mind-blowing and I love it. I might just say one more thing about it, and that's, what are the implications of it replacing artists? And now I can't remember what I've already said on this, but in terms of finding ways of automating people out of their jobs, like, I don't want to get too political here, but like, capitalism will do that anyway. We'll try and find a way of doing it. And it needn't be this tool. Like, there's these strong pressures for that to happen. I can only speak personally about how I intend on using this in future, but I think like I am going to be using more and more generative AI art. But I want to use it as reference. And for these one-man band videos, it's fine to use them for sort of backdrops and occasional cuts and whatever else. In terms of replacing the whole thing and getting everything done in an AI box, I'm just not interested in it. Because whilst I believe it will soon be possible to do that, in order to do complex things, in order to make complex artistic statements, it's going to have to make more and more decisions for me. The AI box is going to have to make more and more decisions for me. And I don't want it to make those decisions, because what's interesting about art is hearing people's perspectives and what they have to say. If it's just going to give me a kind of average of lots of other people's opinions, that's not interesting for me as art. I think this is going to be useful as a reference. At the moment, at the stage I'm dealing with, and this may be the stage I'm always dealing with, as a one-man band, I think it really works in letting me do things that I couldn't. If I'm able to work with bigger teams and do more ambitious music videos, I think it's going to be more of a useful tool as a reference, that I can just kind of put some prompts in and I could give them to whoever's behind the camera and say, like, this is the kind of atmosphere I'm looking for. And then they might be able to say, oh, cool, well, if you like that, here's a sketch. What if we went in this direction? Or, you know, they could generate some other images and say, if you want to do something that's kind of within our resources that we can actually realistically do, how about this, 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 and this? So it makes that whole discussion so much better, and it saves a lot of time. And it makes it easier to hit that emotion and that atmosphere that we're looking for. And that, I think, is great. It's still going to need a human to do it, though. Okay, I'm back again to talk about generative AI art. I'm going to try and keep this concise because I know I've talked so much about it, but there's a lot to say. It just occurred to me that I've talked a lot about the upsides, what I think are the upsides, about, you know, how it's a fantastic tool for capturing atmosphere and mood and emotion in art. I've talked about the downsides, about how there's all of this kind of question of if it's just ripping off other people's intellectual property. Anyway, in terms of the downsides, looking on social media yesterday made me realize there's a really important downside I don't think I've talked about, and that's people losing their jobs. This post said about how he'd heard from a friend that their company had just fired the entire design department and replaced it with AI. Now, the reason why I wasn't worried about it was because I kind of gazed into my crystal ball and I thought, well, you know, I don't think AI is going to be able to replace humans. I think it can complement humans, but there's things humans can do that I can't see AI ever really doing. And if it can, generative art is the least of our worries, which, you know, is all well and good, but just because it would be a foolish thing for companies to do doesn't mean companies aren't going to do it. In fact, there's a lot of economic incentive for companies to fire people and replace them with AI, even though it's going to cause problems down the line and even though skills are going to get lost. Because by that point, the people doing the firing will have moved on to other jobs and they'll be able to point in their CV and say, look how much I improved our margins and made money for our shareholders. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, in a perfect world, businesses and unions and governments would all work together and say, you know what, it's in everyone's interests if, you know, workers don't lose their jobs, if we transition from this old technology to the new technology and make sure that important skills don't get lost. But, you know, that's just not the way the world works. And I think I was naive not to recognize a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, whether or not AI can adequately replace humans or not. So, I don't know. My advice would be, if you are in an industry where it looks like AI could replace your job, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And I can fully understand that if you're listening to me talking about how great I'm finding this very specific aspect of AI, and you just never want to hear another word about it, I can totally understand. The video was actually done quite a while ago, and I've spent my time recently doing the previous episode song already onto the next thing. I mixed them around this time. Yeah, it was kind of a delight to do. And I wasn't sure whether or not I was even going to do generative AI art for this particular song. I was thinking about what's the movement of this song. You know, a very good music video is kind of a dance video. Then what is moving in time to the music? And I thought this is kind of a funeral procession. So with that funeral procession idea, I thought, I mean, I don't know how to get that sort of atmosphere, even using generative AI art. Do I use stop motion or something? One idea I had was maybe I use Google Earth and I take real shots of street locations using Google Earth, and then use, you know, Midjourney to kind of, and then maybe composites like action figures or something, and build a scene out of that, which would have been crazy complicated, and Google Earth doesn't have that kind of resolution on street level, so that wasn't going to work. But just going into Midjourney and saying, okay, what can this give me? Well, you know, I want this particular atmosphere, and then finding very quickly, wow, like every kind of atmospheric image I'm looking for is better than I would have imagined. It was also the case that once I took the Midjourney images that were then turned into the Pika Labs video clips, and then I put them into Final Cut Pro, I thought, right, here the hard work really begins. But it wasn't really that arduous. Quite quickly I was able to go, okay, that goes there, that goes there, and then I was like, okay, I need a little bit more for this bit in the middle, and then I generated that, and then I was like, oh, it's done. Oh, I also want to mention, so I did Midjourney to generate the images, I used Pika Labs to generate the moving clips, but I also used layer picks, I think it's called, for essentially taking a still image and giving it a sense of movement via perspective, but it's not like the things are moving, it's more like the camera is moving. And once you see that particular style, you're like, oh, okay, fair enough, you know, all these images are using the same trick. But what it allows you, I mean, I felt like moving the camera on still images really worked for the mood of this particular song, but also you get much more detail. The video opens with a shot of what I think of as like the singer, his father. It opens with his face. And every time that happens, I'm like, oh, wow. In fact, you know what? Let's talk about what went well. Yeah, I mean, I've talked a lot about generative AI and how that worked. I was really blown away by on this one. And also particularly, I really feel like this is great for traditional music because so many of the images that I'm looking for will hopefully be based on images that are long out of copyright in the public domain. And I feel like there's so much to play with there. So yeah, that's something I kind of feel better about. I've talked a lot about the video as well. In terms of what went well, I was really happy with how the track turned out. And I was also really happy with the decision to not write a melody that is in keeping with most folk songs because, as I mentioned, it becomes so difficult to make it distinctive and to give it its own distinctive emotion. I feel like the resulting song is what I was looking for. It's not quite a folk song, but it still feels like it sounds kind of, I suppose I think of it as, it feels to me as accurate as a good Hollywood historical, you know, drama does. And that's kind of what I'm aiming for because I think there's a place for really nerding out and doing essentially historical reenactment. That's not what I'm super interested in doing myself. So I feel like there's this space that no one else is really occupying of let's take old traditional material and let's try and do it in a way that doesn't put all of the work onto the audience, if that makes sense. So yeah, I was happy with how it came out. I really like the percussion. I really like the sort of timpani roll at the beginning and the kind of military snare. I feel like the emotion kind of worked well. Also, something I was really happy with was the collaboration with Joe Wass. He turned up here and just nailed it, I think. And that made such a difference. His bagpipe solo in the middle, I think really is just filled a hole I wouldn't be able to fill myself. Should we talk about what went badly? Yeah, I mean, as with the last couple of videos, I feel like the more I look, the more problems I see. Green screen, I still haven't really figured out. I think I haven't appreciated how much light you need to have when doing green screen. Hopefully that's something I'm going to keep working at. In terms of generative AI, I've looked at the clips enough times that I can spot, oh yeah, here's this thing that just looks weird and here's this person with like 18 fingers or whatever. But again, for this song particularly, I feel like that kind of fits. It's all kind of a horrific nightmare, I think, which is what I was looking for. Yeah, that's kind of my brand. It's all kind of a horrific nightmare and that's what I'm looking for. That should be my LinkedIn tagline. Well, I did that whole bit earlier covering this in much more detail, and I'm not going to go through all that again. So I will just kind of loosely summarize by saying, despite all of the thorny ethical and legal issues, which might scupper this for me, you know, if I feel like this is ripping people off, I will stop doing it. And that might well happen. But despite that, I really enjoyed it, particularly on this video. I was really happy with the results. I never would have believed that like a one-person operation would be able to get something which, filled with flaws as it is, not just captured the emotion and atmosphere I was looking for, but exceeded it. And for traditional music particularly, I can't wait to play with this again. Once again, thanks again for making it all the way to the end. It's been a journey. I'm gonna mention, like I mentioned in the last video, I do this funny thing with band names where, because my name is so generic, I use a different band name for each project just to make it a little bit easier to remember. So for cover versions, it's James Bell and the Algorithm. For original material, I use James Bell and the 0.2. And for traditional music, I use James Bell and the Unholy Weights. I'll explain what weights bands are in another video. Right. Young man cut down on his prime. Let's watch the video.